Hey everyone, welcome back for our third session presentation for Stream 3. We're going to move straight along. We've got Anthony Caruana doing his presentation for mitigating the risks during a disaster, how to manage the media. Thank you, Anthony. Take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Aaron, and welcome to everybody who's here. I understand that apparently I'm standing between everybody and their lunch break, so I will do my very best to ensure that you all get off for your break, that you can do that for the afternoon presentations in plenty of time. So I'm just going to hit the share button. The way this works, I'm probably not going to be able to see questions as they come in, but I'll move to one of the tables later on. I think after this presentation, table 12 looked like it was an easy one for me to get to. So I'm going to go to table 12 after the presentation. And if anyone's got any questions, they can hit me up there, or you can use my contact details, which will be up on the screen shortly, to email me and ask questions that way. So let me go over there, share, and hit play on my slides. So as I said, the aim of this presentation is to talk about how to manage the media during a disaster. This comes from 20 years of working in the corporate world in a whole bunch of different IT roles, being the cause of a disaster in one case, being involved in the teams mitigating disasters, writing disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, you name it. I've kind of been through that whole gamut on the corporate side. And over the last few years, I've turned my attention to working in the media more. And there's a whole bunch of things that I've learned along the way about how to manage the media when stuff goes pear-shaped in your business. I'm going to apologize. It's always bad form to apologize before you start, but I'm a bit of a Clint Eastwood fan, and I've decided that today's presentation is going to be Clint Eastwood themed, and it's going to be about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I intentionally picked this because Dirty Harry leaves everyone dead at the end, and I didn't think that was the outcome we're all looking for. So I'm going to go through very quickly 3 case studies today. Each one's going to be pretty short, only take a few minutes, but from each one, there are a couple of takeaway lessons that are really, really important to be able to understand. So as I said, I've done over 20 years working in corporate IT, quite a long time working as a freelance journalist, and part of that time overlapped, otherwise I'd be about 90 years old. I've written BCP and disaster plans. I've written about disasters for the media. I think one of the most poignant ones that I was involved with was visiting Christchurch after their massive earthquake and talking to all sorts of different businesses and local government organisations about how they recovered from that massive, devastating event in that city. And I've been involved in executing disaster plans. Now, I know in the security world over the last decade or so, we've had this concept called zero trust. And we've applied it to how we handle assets on our network and people on our networks. But you kind of have to take that same sort of approach when you think about dealing with the media when something goes pear-shaped in your organisation. It is almost impossible to keep a secret. And I say almost because you do sometimes have the opportunity to control things. But that comes from really great planning and preparation. There was this example just this week from Cleanaway, whose CEO was accused of bullying and harassment. And he sent an all-staff email just talking to people about, making sure that information doesn't get out and trying to understand, explain the situation to his personnel. And that email went out outside the organisation into the hands of the media, and you end up with an exclusive in the Financial Review talking about how you're trying to cover stuff up. And it doesn't end up being a great story. I do know of organisations, quite recently that have had really good outcomes in managing a disaster that's happened in their organisation and it not getting out. And that's happened because they've had really good planning in place, really good communication strategies, and they've been able, they've understood that if things get out, it can be quite damaging to the organisation. So they're doing the right things in terms of who they have to talk to, but they don't have to disclose it. You don't want the disclosure to come out in the media without you being in control of the message. So with that, I'm going to start by talking about the good in the good, bad, and the ugly. And this is a case that almost everyone's going to be pretty familiar with. It's about 3 years old now, but it was what happened at the Red Cross Blood Service. The short of it was that an IT contractor put a whole bunch of data on a cloud storage service, but the security settings weren't right. A security researcher found them basically just by sort of randomly searching for stuff. He notified Troy Hunt, who many of you know, and the whole thing was validated and it made the news. Clearly, it became a public incident. Over 500,000 blood donors, information was made public for a short time. The risk of misuse was independently assessed as low, but everyone who was potentially affected was notified. I'm a blood donor and I received emails, text messages. There were obviously very large statements made through the media, through advertising and so forth. Even though it was a third-party contractor, what was amazing about this is the CEO of the Red Cross Blood Service stood on TV and said, "This is a failure on our part. I am the leader of the organisation. I'm taking direct responsibility for this." I've seen other incidents similar to this where they hang the contractor out to dry. And in fact, in this case, even though the CEO took responsibility, that other company lost huge amounts of business afterwards. And my understanding is that they actually folded eventually. So the impact can be quite substantial. But the really big message here is when something went wrong, they actually had a process in place to deal with this. And they had a CEO who was courageous enough to stand up and take the direct responsibility and not try to push the blame out to someone else. So some of the lessons that come from this particular case study, they dealt in facts. If you go back and look at the media coverage of what went on during that incident, no, the Red Cross Blood Service made sure that they got all the information and presented it as a statement of fact. They talked about how this is what happened. The contractor put the data out there. They put the incorrect settings on the data repository on that cloud service. As a result, someone who was looking for vulnerabilities found the data. They ethically notified, they went through an ethical notification process of what happened with that data. Then the Red Cross took responsibility for the issue and they had really strong notification processes in place. Now, those notification processes are now something everyone's got to have if you're handling any personal information. If you've got PII, you need to have those notification processes in place because that's what the data breach notification regime that we operate under requires you to have. Just on the data breach notification regime that we have in Australia, it's interesting to note that in New Zealand, and I know there'll be a lot of people who operate across the Tasman, in New Zealand, those rules are changing later this year so that there'll be notification required for loss of access to data. So even if the data is not breached or sent out to an unauthorized party, you may actually need to notify people if the data can't be accessed. So if you're under a denial of service attack or a ransomware attack and you're confident that no data has been stolen or copied out of the organization, but it can't be accessed for a time, you'll still have to do a notification. So they're the three big lessons there: is notification processes, take responsibility, and get your facts straight. The bad of the good, bad, and the ugly. Online retail is obviously a place where a whole bunch of PII is available to those companies. And also it's a place where a breach can have very, very serious consequences for the commercial viability of an organization. In May 2011, customer data breach was detected by Catch of the Day, which has now changed its name to Catch and is now, in fact, owned by, I think, the same group that owns Coles. So Catch of the Day report said that they had a breach in May 2011. It took 3 years before customers were notified. In fact, just a touch over 3 years. Customers were notified, and Catch actually said that the AFP was notified, Federal Police, but neither the AFP or the Privacy Commissioner say that they were actually notified of the breach at the time. Now, what makes this kind of interesting is that the breach happened at the same time as a funding round went through and Catch picked up $80 million of investment. So it's clear that it's, for an outsider looking at this, the potential is that what's happened is that there's been a breach. It's put some funding at risk, so it's been kept quiet, but eventually it came out. The lesson for this is the truth almost always comes out. Almost always. So I really want people to think about this, about how it comes out, and how you've just got to understand that you might do everything in your power to mitigate the risk of information leaking out of your organization. But what's going to be worse? You fronting up to it and saying, here's the problem, or it coming out 3 years later and your customers discovering that something bad has happened with their information and you've been hiding it from them. I think when it comes to that notification of when a breach happens, I think, you know, the Red Cross Blood Bank's Shelley Park, the CEO, it's got the gold standard for how to do this. This is what she actually said to the media. We are extremely sorry. We are disappointed. We apologize. We accept that this is unacceptable. They apologized unreservedly. They took all the responsibility for that incident. In contrast, I've never really heard Catch take that kind of ownership of the problem and say we did the wrong thing. I have a story about that, but I can't tell you because it was in confidence off the record. But anyway, the third incident I want to talk about is the ugly. This is something that is, this is an incident that resulted in loss of life. It was a huge international incident, and it was terribly handled. In fact, it's so badly handled that it's the stuff of university case studies and academic papers if you go and look for it. Some years ago, in 2010, so this is 10 years ago, a oil rig exploded and the result of that was that 11 people died. About 780 million gallons of oil leaked over 2 weeks, and further leaks from that disaster were found over a number of years afterwards. The environmental impact was huge at the time and is ongoing. That disaster, obviously it's going to be pretty hard to hide something like that. So you know it's going to be out in the public domain. You know people are going to find out about it, and you know that people are going to start asking for the what happened. This was an incident that BP tried to blame on someone else. So even though they operated the oil platform, they pointed to contractors on the oil rig. They pointed to this being a leased oil rig, so they don't own it, so therefore it's not their problem. They weren't the cause of the problem. At every turn, they tried to obfuscate the blame for this. Incredibly, the CEO said these words. He said that it's a pretty tiny incident. It's only a very small amount of oil in a very big ocean. And when someone said to him, he was questioned about the loss of life after a period of time and the impact of this, his response was, you know, I'd just like my life back. It was like the loss of life and the environmental impact just got, you know, it was just a bit too much, and it was just getting in the way of him living his life. It was probably an emotive response from an executive who was under huge pressure, but it played terribly at the time, absolutely terribly. The reason this is a big deal, I think, is because executives need to be trained in how to speak to the media. I worked in the energy industry for a number of years, and for those who can remember back, probably about 10 or so years, or maybe more than that, probably 15 or so years ago, there was a massive power system incident in Victoria where huge swathes of the state were blacked out. Homes in Melbourne were under power outages. We had, you know, everyone was under restrictions on alternate days. You weren't allowed to, it was the peak of summer. We weren't allowed to use air conditioners, all sorts of stuff. It was really, really ugly. And at the time, our CEO went on the TV on the 7:30 report and was asked a bunch of questions about our role as a power system operator's role in those outages and what had happened. And for the most part, the questions were pretty tame to start with. And this is what the media will do when they're speaking to you. They'll ask you a bunch of questions that you're going to feel comfortable with. And then they hit him with the question that he couldn't handle. The question he couldn't handle was, because of the way the power system operates it now, if power is not being used in Victoria, the potential exists for the power being generated in Victoria to go across the border into New South Wales. And he was asked point blank, so if Victorians are under power restrictions, why is energy produced in Victoria going to families in New South Wales? And the question was actually pretty easy to answer if you'd been prepared. The answer to that is, if you're not using electricity, at the time we didn't have mass storage available, so it had to go somewhere. Otherwise, you end up with different problems inside the power system. So it flowed to where it was used, rather than in Victoria where it was not going to be used. He didn't have that answer because he hadn't been prepared for the question. And he was completely flustered. And ultimately, he only lasted about another year in that role before he moved on. You need to have really well trained spokespeople that can handle difficult questions or challenging questions. That's one of the things that we go through. You know, I spoke to a founder of a large company a little while ago and asked him what I thought was a pretty innocuous question about company culture. And, you know, he kind of lost it at me, got angry, became very defensive, all those sorts of things. That was in a practice interview, by the way. It's because he wasn't ready for it, and it threw him a little bit. It's really important to train spokespeople. You need a plan. If you go back through the different lessons that I've spoken about so far today, what you really realize is that the companies that do best when something goes wrong in their businesses are those that have practiced and prepared. It means creating a set of scenarios, and it's exactly the same as what you'll find red teams do, for example, or pen testers do, is they'll think of scenarios where they can break into something or make something go wrong, and then and tease those out. So then you can use that information to fix or make or add more security controls, or to change the way you do things so you can shore up your systems. The same goes with when you're dealing with the media when something goes wrong. What are all the things that potentially could happen in your business? A good example might be if you worked in health services, a denial of service attack could be a really big deal because it could stop access to health data for people. If you're a retailer, it could be about loss of PII, something like what happened to Target in 2013. It could be any kind of security incident that results in either loss of data, loss of access to data, or something that's going to affect the confidence of your customers and your business partners in the market. So you need to think about what all those different possible scenarios are and list them. From that list, you work out who are the best people to speak about this. My advice is people need to put their egos away a little bit. You probably don't want your most senior managers and your CEO answering the day-to-day questions here. If something substantial happens in your business, what you're going to find is that the media is going to ask you a lot of questions. You're going to get, and it'll be different sections of the media asking you similar questions. The best thing you can actually do is direct all of that to a single funnel. So you have a person who is the gatekeeper for your questions. That gatekeeper is then able to say, right, we're getting asked the same question about how did the breach happen, for example. So you have an established set of facts and you give everybody the same facts and you send them out once. You don't go and answer the questions over and over and over and over again. You put out the information once and you deal with it. From that, then you've got the opportunity to actually assess what's going on and continue to own. You need to own the discussion. You're going to get asked a lot of hard questions. Be ready for them. Look at past incidents that have happened. One of the best pieces of advice I've had with dealing with breaches and with incidents is look at your near misses. A good example of that was when we went through the whole big WannaCry thing a couple of years ago. The companies that I spoke to in their ransomware response said, we didn't get hit by WannaCry, but we're being really, really careful and looking at what happened to the people who were so that we can learn from those experiences. So go and actually look for companies that have had disasters and look at their response and learn from it. Learn what sorts of questions you're going to be asked or potentially asked. And then from that, you're able to hone your own response and be prepared. We talk to people about, for example, I'll just stop sharing so I can see what you guys are seeing, you can see me. When we talk to people about that, we talk about the sorts of response they need to be ready for. And that might be, for example, having press statements prepared ahead of time. So for example, you might have something that says, in the event of a data breach, here's what we're going to tell the press, and have a boilerplate ready to go. When I worked in energy, we had boilerplate messaging ready to go for every kind of power system incident we could anticipate. So whether that was a terrorist attack or a system failure of some sort, or any kind of thing that would have potentially gone on. We were ready for that, and we had a whole bunch of ready to go statements. Now, they weren't perfect. You'd have to hone them on the day or at the time of an incident to send them out, but you get them ready ahead of time. We talk about, if you've been involved in education or training or anything like that in the past, you've probably heard about a term called cognitive load. What we try to do is reduce the cognitive load when you do that preparation. It means that when stuff happens, you don't have to think about the anticipatable events. You know that you're going to have to put some messaging out if there's a breach. Be ready for it. Have it done. Have the message ready to go. So you only have to fiddle it a little bit to get it out and ready. Have your contact list ready. Know who you're going to have to contact when something goes on. Just as the privacy rules now and the data breach notification rules require that you have a list of all the people, all your customers, so that you can notify them if their data has been breached. You need to have the same kind of thing ready for your media. Have your media lists ready so that you're ready to communicate. Look, I'm mindful of time, and I actually have rattled through a little bit faster than I'd planned. But if anyone's got any questions, perhaps if you want to pop them into the chat or the Q&A, and I can take a few questions as we go. Okay, we've got one. If a breach occurs due to a vulnerability that someone in the org had raised a long time ago, but the org did not prioritize, how do you recommend that's represented in the media? Look, that's a really tough one. This is why it's really important to actually do the right things. We've got the ASD's Essential 8. There's heaps and heaps of different guidance out there on the keeping systems up to date. If you've been breached because something went, because you haven't done the right thing in terms of your compliance and making sure you keep things up to date, the thing you're going to have to do is just be really honest about it and say, we made a mistake. I look at examples such as, for example, when eBay got breached a number of years ago and a whole bunch of customer data was stolen, their customer numbers and transaction numbers actually went up following the breach, which I thought was, look, at the time you think and go, that's pretty amazing. They've been breached, but more people are going to them. The reason they actually did better was because they accepted the problem, and then they made things a lot better, and they talked to people about being better. So I think that's probably the answer to that one is probably you cop it on the chin and you say, hey, we did the wrong thing. But as a result, we have now fixed that problem, and we are actually now doing things way better than what we ever were before. So I think but the answer is you've got to be honest. If it's because of that, you've got to probably realize that at some point, if you've not been keeping systems up to date and you've been breached as a result of that, someone in the organization might be grumpy about that, particularly if it's the person who's been telling you for 6 months to fix the vulnerability. If that person comes back and says, you know what, they didn't do it, and I'm really sick of not being listened to, and they pick up they go on social media, or they pick up a phone or an email or whatever, and they notify the media, it's going to get out. So I'd say get on the front foot and say, we've done the wrong thing, but we've fixed the problem. Gold standard media releases that one could Google as the starting template. Look, I'd probably go on, I think you need to work backwards for that and look at your particular industry vertical. Look for press release, look for information about breaches that those companies may have had, and then work backwards at the media coverage. And what you'll find is through the media coverage, you'll see certain statements have been repeated because they've been picked up from a press release and reported by multiple parties. So there's probably no gold standard. The PR people, and particularly people involved in crisis comms, have set ways of doing things, and they kind of guard that as their own IP. What do you think of Twitter regular updates during an incident? Be really careful with regular incident updates. I know from my experience of being involved in all sorts of different sorts of system incidents, and whether that's an internal hardware failure or an external attack, the facts can change, because what you think is true in the first hour could be seen to be completely the opposite in another 2 or 3 hours once you've done further investigation. The best answer is to say, I think we are investigating. You can tell you that you're investigating, and when we are certain of what's going on, we will inform. And I think that's the best way of doing things via social media, is to say, we're looking into it, but we're not going to speculate. We know speculation has a mind of its own. If someone loses, if, for example, let's say your company was breached and it looked like a external attack, and the first thing that people tend to do in external attacks is look for attribution of some sort. And then you come back 2 hours later and you say, oh, actually, it wasn't a breach. We did something wrong ourselves. A great example of that is what happened with the census a few years ago. You know, the government department involved came out and screamed screamed DDoS, and then what we actually found was bad system design. So don't speculate unless you know for sure. So when it comes to Twitter, people want information fast. You need to make the decision about whether you want to inform fast or you want to inform right. Companies that have done pen test reviews are real CEO. Look, we do practice. Yeah, practice is really, really important. When I was involved in BCP and DR planning, we used to do really exhaustive end-to-end exercises, but they very rarely went as far as saying, now we're going to put you in front of a camera and a microphone. I think it's really important to actually do that education and training. And you know, unashamed plug, that's what we do at MediaWise. One of the things we do is actually train execs through comms, through their communications during an incident. So yeah, I would say if you're doing a pen test or anything like that, treat it as real and get the person who's going to be your spokesperson up there. If your CEO is a really good media performer, go for it, I guess, because they're probably going to want to be up front. But you probably need a filter in front of your CEO to deal with the hundreds of questions that may come depending on the type of breach you've had. From your view, is it true that people care more about how you handle a breach than that you've had a breach? I think the answer to that is yes, but it's also a question of, was the breach because you did something really, really dumb? You know, something like, for example, you know, if you look at that Red Cross blood bank incident, something that could have been handled really, really badly, and it could have come up really, really poorly. The answer to that question, I guess, is about how you handle breaches. If you handle the breach really well, then the answer is how you handle it will become the story. If you handle the breach poorly, the breach and the data loss and the impact on customers or business partners or whoever, that becomes the story. But if you think about the Red Cross story, if the answer had been, wasn't our fault, we're blaming the contractor, our notification process was really poor, we didn't get, you know, if the blood bank hadn't notified people by email and text and full page ads in newspapers, if their response had been bad, the breach would have been the news. But 5 years later, people are talking about how they handled it as a case study in, you know, handling a breach really well. Sophisticated attack. As someone who's reported on IT security for over a decade, when I see sophisticated attack, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear or not, but I tend to think bullshit. What I see now is that the attack vectors haven't especially changed. Ransomware is still a big thing. You know, most of the, you know, DDoS is still a big thing. I think what's happening is the attackers are getting smarter because they've learned how not to use typos in their phishing emails and stuff like that. So from that perspective, they have become more sophisticated, but the attack vectors haven't changed especially. So when I hear about sophisticated attack, I kind of think, meh, was it really sophisticated, or did you really, were you just fooled by someone who was a little bit, you know, who's picked up their game slightly, and whatever barriers you've had to block them haven't been as good. What do you think of Twitter regular updates during a report? As I said before, I think that one's popped back in. Hang on a sec. People care more about how you handle. I think I've been through all those questions. Does anyone else have anything else they'd like to ask? Oh, that's what's happened. Someone's removing questions I've answered. That's why the list changed on me. Well, with that, I'd hand back over to Aaron. And thanks very much, everybody, for giving us this opportunity to chat. I think this is a really, really critical area on Maersk. I think we're about to wind up. I might take that question offline. If I'm going to hop over to one of the tables shortly, So I think you'll find me. I'm going to go to table 12. I think that if I say that, hopefully people will find me there, and I'll answer that question over there. I think that's from Yvette. So I'll do that when I come back in after this presentation. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks very much, Anthony. That was awesome. We're going to hand over to Adam Spencer before we break for lunch, and then we will be back. I believe the time for reconvening is 12:50. So, but yeah, I'll hand it over to Adam.